WorldCom's fraud was bigger than Enron's, so why don't you remember it? You probably remember Enron's scandals with blockbuster documentaries and courtroom drama. But WorldCom quietly eclipsed Enron by billions and then slipped out of the headlines. In this video, you will follow the story from a small motel owner to a telecommunications colossus built on purchase and illusion. You will learn how a single accounting trick masked real losses and why it wrecked investors and employees alike. The central question is simple but unsettling, and it will guide everything you see. Why would a company so large and influential vanish from public memory despite committing an $11 billion fraud? You will be taken through motives, methods, and moments where choices mattered most, and you will see the human faces behind the numbers. You will also be introduced to people who chose truth over loyalty in the middle of a corporate storm. Bernie Ebbers began life far away from boardrooms and investor conferences in major cities. You will imagine a man running a small motel and selling his business acumen the way other people sell their ideas. He took a set of simple ambitions and turned them into a corporate persona built on confidence, charm, and relentless growth. You will see how personal ambition became corporate strategy as he led his company into aggressive expansion. The company Bernie ran started humbly, but then changed its name to leave the past behind. He co-founded a business that would later become known as WorldCom, and the early strategy was affordable long-distance service for customers. What began as a niche telecom service quickly morphed into an acquisition machine under Ebbers' vision, and you can feel the momentum building in every decision the company made. You will notice that each purchase was framed as a leap toward scale and dominance. Growth by acquisition became the company's defining characteristic, and the pace was relentless. You will learn that WorldCom executed roughly 65 acquisitions in a relatively short time frame, each purchase amplifying both assets and liabilities. Acquisitions were sold to investors as proof of market leadership and strategic genius, but you will see how they also created enormous accounting complexity. What looks like scale on the surface often hides fragile integration and heavy borrowing underneath. Then came the MCI acquisition, the deal that crowned WorldCom as a global telecommunications powerhouse. You will understand that buying MCI transformed WorldCom from an aggregator into a dominant carrier with enormous network reach. The MCI purchase brought prestige and visibility, and you will see how it also brought staggering costs and expectations that would be hard to meet. The sheer size of that deal raised the stakes for management and put intense pressure on financial results. The dot-com bubble framed everything that followed and gave executives cover for risky behavior. You will remember that during the late 1990s and early 2000s, investors rewarded growth and punished anything that looked like stagnation. In that atmosphere, Bernie's charisma and promises of scale felt like a guarantee, and you will see how that social pressure made questionable practices easier to justify internally. What began as optimism soon created a requirement to manufacture success at all costs. But here's where it gets interesting, because pressure creates opportunity for deception at scale. You will see how executives decided to reframe costs as investments rather than admitting to shrinking margins or failed integrations. This is the point where accounting becomes storytelling, and you will begin to understand how a company can look profitable while bleeding cash quietly. The distinction between operating expenses and capital investments will prove crucial to the deception. The central fraud was deceptively simple and devastatingly effective once implemented. You will learn that WorldCom capitalized operating expenses, moving day-to-day charges onto the balance sheet, as if they were long-term investments. When ordinary costs are capitalized, they inflate profits in the short term and skew investors' perceptions. And you will see how this technique allowed WorldCom to report earnings that did not exist. The company created an illusion of growth built on accounting sleight of hand. To understand the damage, you must see the numbers add up differently under deceitful rules. You will appreciate that capitalized expenses are amortized over years, hiding immediate impact and making current profits appear healthier than reality. This accounting maneuver changes not only reported earnings, but also executive bonuses, analyst forecasts, and stock prices. And you will realize those downstream effects mattered for many stakeholders. When this practice spread across billions of dollars, the deception stopped being technical and became catastrophic. Scott Sullivan, the chief financial officer, played a pivotal role in translating strategy into numbers on paper. You will learn that top finance executives can turn corporate desires into accounting entries, and in this case, the translation became fraudulent. Sullivan directed teams and signed off on adjustments that moved expenses into capital accounts, and you will see how centralized control over accounting entries enabled the scheme to persist. When authority and motive align, internal controls can fracture under pressure. Red flags began to accumulate, but they were often explained away in the moment using plausible corporate logic. You will notice that auditors and board members sometimes accepted explanations because the growth narrative seemed convincing enough. What looks like reasonable managerial optimism can sometimes be denial, and you will see how cognitive biases in leadership and external advisors shielded the company from scrutiny long enough for problems to compound. The combination of complexity and credibility created a dangerous blind spot. What happened next will shock you, because a single audit team's curiosity unraveled years of deception very quickly. You will meet Cynthia Cooper, an internal auditor who prioritized truth over corporate quietude and who was willing to dig deeper than others dared. Her role is a reminder that institutions rely on individuals to uphold integrity when incentives push them otherwise. And you will watch how Cooper and her team began to follow unusual account entries and inconsistent documentation. The discovery process began methodically and without fanfare. Cynthia Cooper did not appear on magazine covers, but her work stopped a much larger deception from continuing indefinitely. You will learn how she quietly assembled a team and began checking capitalized expenses with professional skepticism. Her approach was systematic and relentless, and you will see how methodical audit procedures uncovered suspicious journal entries and supporting documents that did not align with legitimate capital projects. The audit trail began to point in a single, troubling direction. Her team found memos and entries that simply should not have existed and then confronted higher-ups with their findings. You will understand that internal auditors often face career risk when they escalate issues that cut against corporate narratives. Cynthia's decision to escalate was not theatrical, but it was courageous, and you will feel the tension as the company responded with denials and delaying tactics before the truth became unavoidable. The discomfort of revelation is often the first sign of real accountability. In June 2002, the cover began to blow off when the CFO made devastating admissions about improper accounting. You will learn that Scott Sullivan eventually admitted that billions had been improperly recorded, and his confession triggered a cascade of restatements. That admission made it impossible for management to maintain the fiction, and you will see how regulators and the market responded almost immediately. The company had to confront not just adjustment figures, but a collapse in credibility that could not be repaired quickly. Once the magnitude of the fraud became public, the accounting numbers were restated and reality set in coldly. You will observe how the restatement recalibrated investor expectations and forced analysts to reprice corporate worth quickly and severely. The company could not refinance the mountain of obligations it had accumulated through acquisitions and unsustainable operations, and you will understand how liquidity pressures turned solvency questions into existential threats. The illusions that once justified expansion became the reason for collapse. On the 21st of July, 2002, WorldCom filed for bankruptcy protection and instantly became the largest bankruptcy in American history at the time. You will feel the enormity of that filing because it eroded trust in corporate America and gave regulators new urgency to act. At the moment of filing, WorldCom listed roughly $107 billion in assets, a staggering figure that illustrated both the scale of the company and the scale of the problem. The bankruptcy was not just a corporate failure, but a social and financial shock that reached many corners of the economy. The immediate fallout extended far beyond executives and auditors into the lives of ordinary employees and small investors. You will remember that thousands of workers lost retirement savings and many lost jobs as the company unraveled. Pension plans and 401k. Accounts tied up in company stock evaporated, and you will see how that human cost made the scandal much more than an abstract lesson about accounting. Corporate deception has a human ledger of losses that rarely makes financial summaries. Bernie Ebbers' personal story became emblematic of triumph and subsequent downfall, and his fate interested both the public and the courts. You will learn that Ebbers took large personal loans using company stock as collateral, tying his fortune directly to WorldCom's market value. When the stock collapsed, those loans became a central issue in legal proceedings, and you will see how personal leverage amplified the stakes for one man whose leadership style had driven the company relentlessly forward. The contrast between his rise and fall is both dramatic and instructive. The legal system eventually held several executives accountable for their roles in the deception, and you will watch the courtroom drama unfold. You will learn that prosecutors argued management knowingly misled investors, and juries heard evidence about intentional manipulation of financial statements. The trials were long and complex, but they focused on the central idea that financial reporting must reflect economic reality rather than managerial optimism. People who orchestrated or approved the fraud faced criminal consequences and public condemnation. Bernie Ebbers was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his part in the fraud and his leadership responsibilities. You will understand that the sentence reflected both the size of the fraud and the perceived breach of trust that senior executives committed. His incarceration became a symbol of corporate accountability, and you will see how the courts used his sentence to signal that leadership cannot hide behind charismatic authority when economic destruction follows. The punishment sought to restore some measure of justice for harmed stakeholders. Ebbers served in prison until he was released in 2020, and then he died shortly thereafter, closing the final chapter of his public life. You will consider how a life that once symbolized achievement ended in isolation and controversy, and you will reflect on the human costs of corporate collapse. The timeline from rise to release underscores how decisions made in boardrooms can echo for decades beyond any single career or headline. Mortality and legacy become intertwined in cases where public trust is broken on an epic scale. WorldCom's fraud was numerically larger than Enron's, yet the scandal receded from cultural memory more quickly. You will ask why the Enron narrative became a cultural touchstone while WorldCom's scandal drifted from the public imagination. The reasons are multiple and revealing. Enron's collapse involved peculiar accounting entities and charismatic executives who became villains in a television-friendly drama, and you will see how storytelling choices shape which scandals enter the cultural canon. Media coverage, the timing of revelations, and the personalities involved all affected which story stuck with the public. You will notice that Enron's rapid, theatrical collapse coincided with a hunger for villainous narratives that the media amplified and repeated endlessly. WorldCom's technical accounting mechanisms were harder to dramatize and required explaining arcane concepts to the public, and you will see how complexity and scale sometimes reduce a scandal's storytelling appeal. The less photogenic a crime appears, the less likely it is to lodge in popular memory. The difference in memory between the two scandals does not change the damage done to ordinary people and investors. You will remember that whether a scandal becomes a household story or not, the financial and social consequences are very real. Understanding why some scandals are remembered, while others are not, helps us think critically about how we assign moral outrage and regulatory energy. The selective memory of scandals can shape legislation and oversight in asymmetrical ways. In the aftermath of WorldCom and contemporaneous scandals, regulators and lawmakers responded with reforms aimed at restoring trust. You will learn that the early 2000s saw major shifts in corporate governance rules designed to tighten audits and executive responsibility. Laws like Sarbanes-Oxley emerged from a cultural consensus that corporate reporting needed stricter verification, and you will see how those reforms elevated the role of internal auditors and independent oversight. The reforms were meant to make cases like WorldCom harder to repeat. Cynthia Cooper's story became a template for whistleblower courage and professional ethics in auditing circles. You will note that her actions demonstrated the power of internal controls when used without fear, and that her legacy influenced how organizations structured audit independence. Her work also raised questions about corporate culture and incentives, and you will see how one person's insistence on truth can alter the course of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. The moral clarity of her decisions continues to carry lessons for future auditors. So what should you take away from this forgotten scandal that was bigger than Enron, yet less remembered? You will understand that scale alone does not determine cultural memory, and that narrative simplicity often trumps numerical magnitude. More importantly, you will carry a lesson about incentives and accountability. When short-term appearance becomes more valuable than long-term health, institutions corrode in ways that eventually hurt ordinary people. The right structures and courageous individuals matter enormously. The philosophical twist is that collective memory is itself an economic resource often allocated unevenly, and you will realize how public attention shapes where we demand reform. You will see that which scandals persist in memory affects policy, punishment, and prevention in unequal ways. If you believe accountability should be consistent regardless of storytelling appeal, then remembering WorldCom becomes an ethical obligation as much as a historical curiosity. Memory and justice are more connected than they often seem. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and consider sharing this story with someone who remembers Enron but not WorldCom. You will help revive a crucial conversation about corporate responsibility, audit independence, and the human costs of financial deception. Thank you for watching this deep dive into a massive but forgotten scandal. And remember that institutional courage sometimes comes from the least likely places. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe.